Business Diplomacy Today, the podcast about international relations and geopolitics from a business perspective. We help you anticipate the changing political and societal trends that influence your business.
Welcome. My name is Matthias Carton. I'm your host. Business Diplomacy Today is presented by the German Maritime Centre. To find out more about the centre, go to maritime.center. You can also find the link in the show notes. Today we will talk about two very important topics and the connection between them, namely climate change and maritime security. And as always, I have a wonderful, very knowledgeable guest with me, and today that is Dr. Kira Vinke. Kira is the Deputy Research Director at the German Council on Foreign Relations, better known by its German acronym DGAP, where she also heads the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy. In that role, she works at the frontier of two worlds that have traditionally been kept separate, and I named them climate science and geopolitical strategy. Before joining DGAP, she spent nearly a decade at the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, and she has also consulted for Germany's International Development Agency and the Asian Development Bank. Kira's research has taken her into the field across South Asia, the Pacific and the Sahel, regions that are obviously on the front lines of climate stress, and she completed her PhD at Humboldt University in Berlin. And I think the topic was also the link between climate change and migration, if I'm not mistaken. She currently serves on the advisory board of Germany's Federal Academy for Security Policy, and she's a member of numerous organizations working on humanitarian and climate issues. In short, Kira brings together rigorous research, field experience, and policy influence in a way that very few people do. And that makes her obviously a perfect guest for the podcast here. I'm very happy that she joins us. Welcome to Business Diplomacy Today, Kira.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Let's maybe begin with your institution, the DGAP, as I said, it's usually called, at least in Germany. What is it? What's the role of that institution?
So we are a foreign policy think tank. So what we do is we do applied research and policy advice to the German federal government. And this, of course, is directed at the foreign ministry, but also at security and defense, but also, for example, development cooperation, environmental ministry. So we have a set of actors who have some linkage to also foreign policy dimensions. And there we reach out and we try to advise, and we also provide advice to the parliament and also industry actors. So we do advise and do research and also bring people together.
You cover a very, very broad portfolio, obviously, of topics. Now, climate change, of course, everybody knows what it is and what the challenges are, at least in rough terms. Geopolitics is also, I should say, increasingly on everyone's minds in the past couple of years for a number of reasons. But the two, how do they go together? Why are these even interrelated topics?
Yes, so this is quite fascinating, and this is also why our Center for Climate and Foreign Policy at the German Council on Foreign Relations is so special, because we are situated in this think tank that works on foreign and security policy, but we do focus on the issue of climate change, climate security. And here the interlinkages are becoming more and more apparent. First of all, we are seeing the different dimensions of climate change and how they impact human livelihoods. So through floods or droughts or tropical cyclones, we are seeing how livelihoods erode. We are witnessing these effects in Europe, in the US, but also especially in countries that are most vulnerable, the countries where there's poverty, where there be deficits in governance. And here you can also see that once this societal fabric already has some holes, climate change may be able to widen these holes and contribute to polarization of different parts of society.
Now, we will talk about those issues in general, but we will also focus a little bit on the maritime part of that, maritime security. Of course, that makes sense because we are here sitting at the German Maritime Centre, so that's what we particularly look at. So maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of the seas. Of course, they play an important role in climate change. We expect sea levels to rise. We expect some of the ice in the Arctic region to melt, or maybe all of it eventually. Could you explain to our listeners what the connection is specifically with the sea when it comes to climate change and security?
So as you described, the oceans are already facing very severe climate impacts. The oceans are an important regulator in the climate system. They are absorbing carbon, they are absorbing heat, and people's livelihoods depend on the oceans. So we see this obviously in fisheries, but we also see it in the transport sector. Our global trade system would be unimaginable without trade through the oceans. And here the climate impacts are affecting trade routes. For example, extreme storms mean that maybe ships have to deviate their trade routes, have to go different routes to avoid the storms, or may lose freight because of a storm. Then you have the situation of fisheries, where fisheries of small scale may be impacted by the effects of coral bleaching and the dying off of biodiversity in certain parts of the ocean. And so there's a multitude of effects, really, and we are seeing more and more how climate change interlinks with these also more geopolitical dimensions. So in its effect on trade routes in particular, but also in its effect of how coastal communities have to adapt to the changing environment and what pressures they face.
Do you have the impression that these two parts, climate change and geopolitics, that it's more widely recognized that they belong together rather than being alternative things? And the reason I'm asking is that, for example, when the Russian invasion in Ukraine started 4 years ago, a lot of people said, well, we need to push climate change goals a little bit. We need to put this on the back burner because we have more urgent, hard geopolitical issues to deal with. Has that changed?
You're right that this was the initial reaction and is until today, I think, a common theme to say, okay, we'll deal with the climate crisis later. And right now we have to do crisis management regarding geopolitical conflict, Russia's war of aggression, for example. But we have to see the interconnectedness here. Russia has benefited greatly from our fossil fuel imports, mainly gas, but also oil. And we remain dependent on fossil fuel imports. Now we have replaced in Germany, for example, most of the Russian gas imports with American LNG, so liquefied natural gas. However, this is also undergoing some stress, right? So there's price volatility. There is relationship to the United States, which is right now under a lot of pressure from the up and downs of the Trump government, from trade threats, tariff threats by the Trump government. So this dependency, I think, has become much more clear. And current investment discussions on gas infrastructure could prolong certain dependencies. So I think this is really a crucial moment in time to continue the path of the green energy transition. Of course, we will need some gas as a backup option, but not to be fooled into the American energy dominance agenda, which is a fossil fuel agenda that also just serves very particular interests of the Trump administration, mainly to please their greatest funders, which are among them the fossil fuel industry. So I think there is a wider recognition of these interlinkages, but we are seeing also an emergence of potential pushback on the green agenda because people are following somehow this idea of Donald Trump that fossil fuels may be still viable in the future, which will lead us into environmental catastrophe.
Yeah, we also see that the maritime sector, of course, the IMO in the fall failed to agree on the emission system, largely because of pushback from the US and some of its allies. What's your outlook? Do you think that will change? I mean, officially, at least with the IMO, it was just postponed. So the next meeting will come up in the fall of this year. Will anything have changed?
So the IMO negotiations, this was really a low point in terms of the pushing back of environmental agenda that would have served both the economy and also environmental protection. There was large agreement to push this regulation through, to have more solidified long-term goals, to have a pricing incentive. And the Trump administration really threatened countries to vote according to their interests. And I assume this will continue. So at the same time, the Trump administration is trying to undo much of the international system, including the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement. They have left both of these. And they are trying to undermine the UN system. And now is the time for European leaders to stand together with other like-minded countries and find a way out, and find a way to preserve these, because as you mentioned, maritime security is already affected by these very strong changes, and we need to be prepared. And we are also seeing another big actor, namely China, which is prepared to go down the road of renewable energy, which is already investing more in renewable energy than the US, Europe, UK together. So I think the shots are no longer being called in Washington in this regard, but more so in China. And if our industries want to remain competitive, we have to look at the Asian markets and also see, okay, we need to become more independent of this fossil fuel agenda.
Yeah, that's interesting how things have changed with the Trump administration and its position on the global stage, that China is able to present itself as the pioneer in when it comes to renewables, but also sometimes it seems as the guardian of multilateralism, which is ironic in a certain way, because we all know that they also like to use force and bully countries in their near abroad. You talked about the risks for the maritime world, climate events that will probably occur more frequently, storms and stuff like that. But there's also, one could at least argue, is a positive side to climate change when it comes at least to shipping. New shipping lanes might or will be opening up, notably I think through the Arctic. What do you say to that? If, there was a ship owner sitting here and say, well, that's quite nice. I have a much shorter route in the future from Asia to Europe. Is that true, or is that too short-sighted?
Of course, it's true that once the Arctic sea ice melts and there's ice-free summers, then shorter trading route will be possible. But at the same time, we have to look at this in the larger picture, what these changes mean, because they're of course not occurring in isolation. They also mean that not only the sea ice is melting, also the Greenland ice sheet is melting in this time. We will see more extreme weather events. So we will have overall worsening environmental conditions. And the retreat of the Arctic sea ice also means that, of course, actors such as Russia have more access to this area as well. And maybe the Arctic may become a much more contested space. We are already seeing the first signs of this from the US, actually, with regard to Greenland and Trump's ambitions to acquire Greenland, which are, of course, born out of narcissism and the idea to become a president who has territorially enlarged the United States. But at the same time, I think there is a strategic element in this as well, that he does recognize climate change as being real, so to say, secretly. Ironically. He does believe that the ice sheet and also the sea ice will retreat. And he sees also economic opportunity, or people around him see economic opportunity arising there. I talked to Vivian Motzfeldt recently. She was at the Munich Security Conference. She's the foreign minister of Greenland. And I asked her a similar question in this direction. And she said, we need the ice. So you could think maybe people in Greenland would see, oh, this is a great business case. But no, she immediately responded, we need the ice. This is part of our livelihood, of our indigenous identity. We need it for hunting. We need it to preserve our culture. And I also interpret into it somehow also our unity as a people and the social fabric. So there's many elements to this. And I think shipping is one element. Yeah.
It's all connected. And we also see that, some points in some parts of the world, we might have too much water. In others, we have too little. Panama Canal is one example, I believe.
Exactly. So you have these different trade choke points that are seeing a number of pressures. So Panama Canal was also one thing that was in sort of Trump's vision to occupy more closely. At the same time, it's facing severe threats from droughts. So in 2024, for example, there was a severe drought which sort of wiped out $1 billion in income for Panama. And because simply, if there's a drought, the water levels are too low to have the same carrying capacity for ships going through, especially at the Lake Gatun, the water levels are dropping. And so it's a difficult balancing act. Yeah. So take the case of Panama. They are a country that also rely on their natural environment, for example, for tourism. They have the canal, which is a very important income. They have many, many people who work in agricultural sector, like 30-40% of people work in the agricultural sector, which only contributes a sort of fraction of the GDP because they have these other sources of income. But you have this mass of people that are reliant on livelihoods there. So you have to, when you think of water and water security in that area, also in the area of the canal, and how you sort of spend the water, so to say, then you have to think of different actors. Of course, coming from a maritime perspective, you would think of maybe the shipping industry needing to pass through there. But if you're a government official in Panama, you also have to think of your farmers, etc. And there's multiple stressors on Panama in this case. Also the stress of migration, for example, through the Darien Gap, where 500,000 people are migrating through, and some of them also for environmental reasons.
Yeah.
So it's really also a hotspot of these changes that we are witnessing, where the political comes together with the environmental stress.
What other choke points come to mind when we talk about climate issues and climate change?
I mean, of course, also Suez Canal. We saw here what happens when conditions worsen, and an incident happened some years ago where the Suez Canal was blocked and disrupting for a long period of time trade flows through that canal. And of course, the investigation shows so far that there's, of course, human error involved in this. But people are also saying, okay, there was a big sandstorm that decreased visibility, which is why the tanker moved in a way that it shouldn't have and therefore blocked the canal. So you see how disruptive these things can be. And then you can see the dependencies in the supply chain that are already there, and that mean then if parts of the supply chains are disrupted, that this can have ripple-on effects across the globe, very far away from this specific choke point.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, I mean, of course, in the case of Egypt, I believe it also has a significant impact on the country's economy, because it's probably not as much as in the case of Panama, but the canal also contributes a significant percentage to the budget of the government in Egypt.
Exactly. And if you look at it from another perspective yet, for example, there are some arguments made that in the Malacca Strait, where China is dependent on for its oil supply, for example, that China sees this choke point as such a strategic sort of challenge that is part of the reason why they are investing also so much away from fossil fuels and into renewable technology, because they know that they, like us in Germany, for example, cannot provide in their case, growing population, growing demand of fossil fuels. And therefore, they try to shift, for example, towards EVs, because they know they don't have enough oil for a growing Chinese population to continuously supply them with homegrown oil, so to say. And therefore, they said, like, no, we want to become sort of an electro state, electrifying all of our sectors which we can, and therefore become more independent from these imports. So I think this is also a strategic decision, and it has to do also with this uncertainties around trade choke points, of course, being potentially also focus points for military conflict in case there are tensions arising.
Yeah, interesting. I was in mainland China in December after a number of years that I hadn't been there, and I was quite impressed to see how many EV cars there are on the streets. It's almost difficult to find a combustion engine.
Yes, and we have sort of lost that race almost, yeah? So maybe now we can try to play catch up. But China has, through also aggressive subsidies, but also through high innovation. And I think this is the part that is more painful for German automotive makers. Of course, it's aggressive subsidies, but at the same time, they were also able to innovate and have designed cars that appear to be quite modern and also that are in a price range that their customers can afford them. And I think we need to look at this change that China is driving from a perspective also of our German industry, which is, of course, reliant on exports, but which is also dependent on supply chain from China, a great dependency regarding rare earths, etc. And we need to see where we can still be competitive in the race to what seems to be the range of technologies, of course, in the renewable sector and energy efficiency, etc., where we can still play a role in the future. And this includes, for example, just before you ask your next question, this includes also, I believe, for example, sustainable sea transport. So here in Germany, in Europe, we have shipbuilders in Lea, for example, universities who do research on sustainable sea transport. And I think even though the IMO negotiations didn't go the way they should have been going this time around, but in a few years, there will be no question about the fact that also the shipping industry needs to lower their emissions. And many companies have already started on this pathway of trying to figure out how to become less carbon intensive, how to find also different types of fuels, different types of motors, etc. And I think this is an area where European industry should invest.
I think at least when we talk to German and European ship owners, they all recognize that, and they are all very much in favor of rules. They recognize the necessity. Of course, what they say, and I guess rightly so, is that what they want is a framework that is a level playing field for all players globally, and also ideally a simple system that works globally and not 23 different emission trade systems with different reporting requirements, which I guess would not work very well.
A bold prediction. The world in 10 years.
A bold prediction is one of our fixed segments. We ask all our guests to bring their crystal ball and give us an idea of how they think the world will look like in 10 years when it comes to the topic that we're discussing. So Kira, what's your prediction?
So I think we can maybe take two scenarios. One would be a scenario where in the mid-2030s, we have maybe achieved some of the goals that we wanted to achieve by 2030, which are the Sustainable Development Goals, where we are maybe on a path towards climate neutrality, and where we were able to make this switch. It may not happen in the next 2 years, but I think there is a good chance that it may happen in the next 5 years. And we will have recognized that some is lost. Probably the Arctic summer sea ice will have started to gravely disappear in that time frame. At the same time, there are systems that we were able to protect. So I think this decade is really crucial to make the choices, because the alternative that we continue on the path that we're currently on, which I believe the Trump administration is trying to force the world upon, is a world that would lead humanity into a sort of abyss. And it would mean grave changes that would occur, including, for example, the loss of the Greenland ice sheet, where we would have significant multi-meter sea level rise unfolding over longer time periods. But these changes would be gravely visible if we continue on this path. So I believe that there is the chance for a positive future, for one in which there's less pollution, in which the coastal areas are better protected against the changes that are coming. But it's a future we will have to work very hard for.
You're hedging your bets. That's good. So when we invite you back in 10 years, it'll be hard to pinpoint. But which of the scenarios is more likely? Are you still an optimist or are you a pessimist?
I'm an optimist because I do believe that people are bright enough, that we have enough capacity in this world to live a life that serves the future and does not destroy it.
That's great. You still have some faith in humanity. That's a good sign. Let's hope that you are right on that point. Now, our podcast focuses on business leaders mainly. So when we listen to all the issues that we've discussed, one might think as a business leader, well, this is all so complicated. It's all interrelated. First of all, where do we even start? And second of all, what does it mean for me? What can I do? Both in terms of maybe helping to solve the conundrum that we're in, but also when it comes to protecting my business from insecurities that may arise from that interplay between geopolitics and climate change. So what recommendations do you have for our listeners when it comes to that? Is there anything you can do, or is it just something that you observe and you try to take it on and maneuver through it when it arises, or can you actually prepare for those things?
I think those businesses that have, for example, in different places, manufacturing capacity, etc., I would recommend to them to really take a day and take a look at the regional chapter that is applicable to you of the IPCC, of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and just take a look at the projections. Of course, this is nothing that may be affecting you in the time frame that you as a business leader may need to make decisions. So, of course, there is the urgency of the now. But I think it's very important to keep in mind what changes may be coming and to understand what that would mean for your business's future. So I think really taking a look at the reality of what may come, because I see right now that people are so caught up in the moment of the crisis and in the distractions that we are all facing from social media, from another crazy idea that's coming across the Atlantic, from the demands of the time, and are somehow choosing to ignore the looming threats, which are biodiversity loss, which are the climate crisis that could render some of these crises almost irrelevant in terms of scale of what may be coming towards us in case, for example, the Gulf Stream collapses. So just to have this perspective and maybe try to break down what it means also to protect your assets where you are, I think is very crucial. And then I would call on business leaders to try to stay course. There is a storm coming and it's shaking us all up. The storm is maybe wanting us to shift course, but abolishing, for example, climate targets will in the end, in my view, not help medium-term competitiveness. It may provide for some businesses some short-term relief, which they are urgently looking for, but it may provide disasters in the future on different levels. So try to stay course, try to implement what you can, even if you cannot change it all.
Have you worked with scenario planning, and do you think that's a useful exercise in such a situation?
Yes, so we did scenario planning with the NATO in Kuwait, at the regional center of the NATO in the Kuwait, with military there, military personnel from the Gulf region and NATO personnel as well. And we wanted to understand how the changes that are coming, storms, extreme heat, are affecting military capabilities and what changes can be made to increase capabilities. And for different scenarios, also from land, sea, air, and understanding how they are preparing and how also the civilian sector can work better with, for example, the Navy if there is a crisis. And this always provides, in my view, very useful because people take on different mindsets, different roles. They start to think outside of the box. And even though they may not be able to apply every little thing you discuss there, there's a sort of mindset shift and some connections are made which were previously not. And that would help people also to, if the crisis materializes, to really be ready and to maybe have also thought through some procedures. And while I'm talking now about the military capabilities, of course, there's also the same sort of question when it comes to the civilian sector and playing through different scenarios and what it means. And there may also be things that across both the sort of positive scenario and the negative scenario may still be valuable to do in either. So, and those are the things that you may be able to then also change with some investments.
Yeah, I find it very helpful because it also moves away a little bit from this notion of prediction, which is always hard to do. Somebody, I don't know, there's a quip says, predictions are always hard, especially when they concern the future. So, and of course, scenario development or scenario method tries to avoid that by painting alternative scenarios and alternative
and
pictures.
they also sort of bring together different elements. Yeah, so because if you look at the academic side of it, you have papers that look into the very specifics of how maybe the Greenland ice sheet or part of that will behave under this or that emissions scenario. But of course, for decision makers, they do not only have to take into account the environmental change, they have to take into account how will different parts of society react, how will the business leaders make their choices, are their supply chains resilient? And so you need to bring together different bodies of knowledge and different actors around the table and have them talk to each other to be better prepared and not only have a sort of tunnel vision of one specific area. Yeah.
Being a politician is not easy. I don't envy them. Everybody seems to complain about them, but I don't envy them. They have a tough job.
Executive briefing. What you should read now.
Executive briefing is another fixed segment, and we always ask our guests to bring some suggestions on what might people read or look at if they want to learn more about the topics that we've been discussing in this episode. What is your executive briefing, Kira?
So I have two recommendations. One is we have just published a memo series on global reordering, which encompasses a short set of briefings across different sectors, from trade to science as a field of strategic competition. And this brings together different perspectives from our institute, the German Council on Foreign Relations, and it's different expertise, and it's quite short and I think quite useful at this moment in time. And the other one is a publication which we have already released, I think 2 years ago, which is on the disruption of Arctic exceptionalism, which looks at the situation in the Arctic and the different pressures of geopolitics and environmental change, and also the different aspirations of resource exploration in the Arctic. And although it's already 2 years old, I think it's still very much relevant today.
Excellent. And your institution being a think tank that is focusing on decision makers, of course, these things are usually easy to read and well understandable also for a non-academic audience. As always, we will put the links to those publications in the show notes so that people can find them there. Let me get a little bit towards the end by asking you a more general question. We've heard about all the changes that are coming. Everything seems to be connected. Geopolitics, climate change, things become difficult. Some things may become easier, but probably most things will become more difficult. There are no easy solutions, although we all know in general terms what needs to be done. Putting that into practice seems to be difficult for us as humanity. When it comes to global trade and general openness of the world, what's your take? Do you think we will still continue to live in a world that is basically characterized by free trade, more or less open borders, at least for some people? Or will we be moving towards more isolation, where we have protectionism, where we will have nearshoring and things like that being the dominant factors that drive the economy?
I think right now the system is moving towards a more protectionist, nearshoring scenario. However, this can change. We are seeing that some of the norms under which trade has been realized over the past decades are coming under attack and are being disregarded by many actors. So the question is whether new norms will emerge and who will shape these norms. And here European leaders should really make an effort to be the shapers of regulation, the shapers of maybe also a new emerging world order that also then includes the regulations for trade.
Interesting. Yes, Europe has to reinvent itself in one way or another. We still seem to struggle with that, and we also often don't agree, the 27 nations that make up the European Union. But maybe when the necessity and the pressure gets high enough, maybe there will be a solution. Kira, thank you very much for this very, very insightful session and the discussion around climate change and maritime security.
Thanks for having me.
This was another episode of the Business Diplomacy Today podcast. This podcast is presented by the German Maritime Centre. If you like the show, make sure to subscribe to it on your favorite podcasting platform. And of course, we would also be delighted if you would leave a review or a rating there. You can also go to our website at businessdiplomacy.today to check out the show notes of this episode. That's it for today. Thanks for listening.